With each passing month, little James Leiniger seemed to be peeling back memories of a past life.
Ooh, hey.
Vivid memories that scared and astonished his parents.
Bruce had always said, what kind of plane did you fly? And he said, a Corsair.
Yeah.
He said a Corsair?
He said the word Corsair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not only did James remember flying a Corsair, he demonstrated knowledge of the plane's peculiarities, like the time he was flipping through a book about planes when he was 4.
And he got to the Corsair, and he said, that's a Corsair. And he goes, you know what? They used to get flat tires all the time.
In fact, historians and pilots agree that the plane's tires took a lot of punishment on landing. Of course, this is a fact that could easily be found in books or on TV. But then, James began to offer up the kinds of specific details his parents say are harder to explain away.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, do you remember where your plane took off? And he said it took off of a boat. Do you remember the name of your boat? Natoma. Do you remember what your name was? And he'd always say, James. His name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with? And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
And there were more clues. Around this time, James began signing crayon drawings and other artwork, James 3.
One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. It was because I'm the third James. And every once in a while you ask him that today, and he'll still say the same thing.
And one day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and he goes, Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down. And I said, what? That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy. And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. He learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston, Jr. Is this why little James was calling himself James 3?
It just crystallized in my mind. This has to be who we're talking about. You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, well, can you show me where it was? And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Clarber. Clarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3rd, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Clarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston, Jr. It was to be Hugh's last mission before leaving for home the following day. As Clarber recalls, the sky was thick with enemy flak.
We experienced pretty heavy aircraft fire, but this was the most intense that I experienced at any time.
Suddenly, a flash near the nose of Houston's plane.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head-on. Yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it. So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston, Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something. And that's essentially what I believe.
Dear Bruce and Andrea.
And he's not the only one. This past October, the Leinigers received a letter from a woman named Ann Barron, the sister of pilot James Houston. Andrea and Bruce had contacted her about their little boy. Barron heard about what young James was saying, and she believes.
All of this is still overwhelming. I can only imagine how it has affected you, but I believe, with my love to you, Anne. the child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know unless there is a spiritual thing.